The dust on Kale's boots was the color of old bone. He'd stopped noticing it 3 months ago, back when the Vethari occupation entered what their commanders politely called the consolidation phase, which was a bureaucratic way of saying finished burning the cities and were now deciding what to do with what remained. Kale had spent those 3 months in a concrete basement in what used to be a university district, surrounded by salvaged server components, dietary tablets that tasted like chalk, and the low persistent hum of a quantum array he'd spent 11 years of his life building. He didn't think about the cities anymore. He thought about the array. His name was Kale Marin. Before the Vethari came, he had been the world's most cited researcher in the field of unified consciousness architecture, which was a way of saying that he had spent his career asking one question. What exactly makes a mind a mind? Not the neurons, not the electrical signal, the quality of awareness itself. The strange, irreducible fact that something was home behind the eyes. His wife, Lena, called it the ghost problem. She was a biologist. She understood living systems better than any person alive, and she still couldn't tell him why she was conscious, and a sea cucumber wasn't. He found this delightful. He told her all at once over coffee in their garden behind the house in the hills, where she had planted sunflowers in a ring around a Faraday enclosure he'd built to give her a space of real quiet. She had thrown a clod of dirt at him, laughing that was before. The Vethari had arrived 14 months ago, not with a dramatic descent through clouds or a flash of light over major cities. They materialized in orbit and spent the first week simply watching. Human governments went through the predictable cycle: denial, then panic, then desperate overtures of communication. The Vethari did not respond. They were not interested in negotiation. They were interested in something else entirely. Though it took 3 more months of systematic orbital bombardment and ground invasion before Kale understood what that something was. They were interested in minds, not human bodies, not the planet's resources. The Vethari had a biology that made carbon-based matter almost irrelevant to them. They were a distributed consciousness, a species that had shed physical form so long ago that individual Vethari were more like nodes in a network than independent beings. What they wanted, what they had traveled an incomprehensible distance to acquire, was novel consciousness architecture. They had encountered it before, on 9 other worlds. They had absorbed it each time. They called this process, as near as the captured xenolinguists could determine, something that translated roughly as completion. They were here to complete themselves, with humanity. The method was elegant in the way that a dissection is elegant. Vethari field teams, which appeared as shifting geometric lattices of light and required no physical space to occupy, would envelop a human subject. Within 6 minutes, the subject would stand up, walk calmly into a waiting transport, and never speak again. Not because they were dead, because they were still in some technical sense there. Their consciousness mapped, cataloged, integrated into the Vethari network. Their body was irrelevant. Their ghost, as Lena would have said, was the point. Kale had watched this happen to 4,000 people before the basement door held. He did not let himself think about Lena's name on the list that Max had smuggled out of the processing center. He thought about the array instead. It had taken him 11 years to build the consciousness architecture he called Perrin, the persistent recursive identity network. The name was clunky and his graduate students had teased him about it mercilessly. The idea was not clunky. The idea was that human consciousness was not a product of biological hardware, but rather an emergent pattern, a standing wave in the medium of neural activity. And that if you could map the wave precisely enough, you could run it somewhere else. Not simulate a person, not model their behavior, actually run them. The ghost transported. He had proven it in principle 18 months before the Vethari arrived. He had mapped a chimpanzee, a female named Sable, who had lived at the research facility for 12 years, and had a personality his team described, with scientific caution, as opinionated. He had run Sable's pattern on the array. She had recognized her handler through a camera. She had chosen her favorite food from a displayed list. She had been, by every measure Kale could design herself, in a box of processors that fit in a standard lab rack. He had told almost no one. The ethics reviews alone would have taken years, and years were something the world had not turned out to have. The Vethari changed his thinking about timelines. He had started the full human mapping project 3 weeks after the invasion, working in secret in the basement with a skeleton team. Max Warden, his oldest colleague and the most principled person KL had ever met. Dr. Yuna Cho, his postdoc, who had been in the middle of a dissertation on consciousness and temporal continuity. and two former graduate students whose names Cale had memorized because he had promised himself he would remember everyone who helped. The equipment was salvaged, jury-rigged, cooled with a setup that sounded like a dying dishwasher, and kept the array at operational temperature through a combination of stolen industrial refrigerant and what Max grimly called ambient desperation. The full mapping took 9 months. Cale barely slept. He ate the chalk tablets and drank coffee that had been reconstituted from powder, with water that tasted faintly of rust, and thought about the garden. Lena had told him that sunflowers follow the sun. He thought about that a lot in the dark. The day he was ready, he called Max into the server room. "I need you to do something," Cale said. "And I need you to tell me it's wrong first, so I know you've thought about it." Max looked at him for a long time. Max was 61 years old and had spent the face of a man who had spent 6 decades refusing to accept simple answers to complicated questions. "It's wrong," he said. "Uploading a human consciousness without informed consent from the subject is ethically indefensible, potentially constitutes a form of identity violence, and opens questions about continuity of personhood that the philosophical literature has not resolved in 3,000 years of trying." He paused. "Also, you look terrible. When did you last sleep?" "Tell me it's also necessary," Cale said. "It's necessary," Max said. "What do you need from me?" What Cale needed from him was the most precise full brain scan ever attempted on a living human subject, conducted in a basement with equipment that had been assembled from parts of 11 different devices and held together in several places with actual wire. The process would take 6 hours. At the end of it, if everything worked, the pattern running inside the array would be indistinguishable by every measure Cale could design from the man who had sat down in the scanner. But the man who sat down in the scanner would not be Max. Cale climbed into the chair himself. "I want to be clear," Max said, watching the calibration run, "that I think this is the worst idea you have ever had, and you once suggested we use thermal expansion calculations to route signal pathways in a cryogenic array. The thermal idea was elegant. It was genuinely insane." Max's voice was steady, but his hands were not entirely steady checking the electrode leads. "How do you know it will be you, afterwards, in there?" "I don't," Cale said. "I know that Sable knew herself. I know that the mapping is complete enough that if it isn't me, it will be functionally indistinguishable from me, which at some level is the same question with a different emotional valence." He looked at the ceiling, old concrete, water stain in one corner that he'd been looking at for 9 months. "And I know that the Vethari are 3 blocks away, and they have a scan sensitivity that will detect the array in approximately 40 hours. Max was quiet for a moment. "The garden," he said. "Did you?" "All right, done," Cale said. "Before any of this, I made sure." The scan took 6 hours and 17 minutes. Cale sat very still and thought about the garden. The particular slant of light on late summer afternoons, the way the flowers turned toward it, with that slow, patient fidelity, and Lena sitting with her feet in the grass reading a paper she disagreed with, and arguing with it aloud when she thought he wasn't listening. He thought about all of it as precisely as he could, because he understood, in a way he hadn't entirely confronted before sitting down, that this was what he was trying to preserve. Not a technical curiosity, not a research subject, the specific irreplaceable texture of a particular human mind. Then the lights in the array came on. There was a camera. There was a speaker. There was a moment of silence that lasted 11 seconds, which Cale later said. The Cale in the chair, who was still very much there and quite dizzy from the scan, felt like watching someone wake up. "Max," the array said, "the refrigerant compressor is running 3 degrees hot. You need to vent the secondary loop." Max laughed for the first time in 4 months. It was an ugly, ragged sound, but it was genuine. What followed was 2 weeks of the strangest existence Cale had ever experienced, both versions of it. The Cafel in the chair recovered, ate terrible food, and argued with his own consciousness through a terminal, with the specific unnerving quality of a man debating his reflection in a mirror that sometimes disagreed with him. They were the same person. They were also so unmistakably not. The one in the array had no vestibular sense, no hunger, no peripheral warmth. The one in the chair could not reach into a satellite network from a standing start and read Vethari signal traffic in real time. That turned out to be important. The Vethari used a distributed consciousness architecture that, once Cale could examine it from the inside, through the array's access to global networks, exploiting signal pathways the aliens had not thought to fully secure because they had never encountered an intelligence that could contest them at that layer, turned out to be remarkable and remarkably brittle. They were vast. They were not in the way that mattered deep. Every consciousness they had absorbed was in the network but not preserved. It was processed, flattened, reduced to what was useful, and the rest discarded. The Vethari did not understand that what they were throwing away was the point. They did not understand irony. They did not understand the particular human habit of caring for something fragile on purpose. They did not understand why Lena had chosen sunflowers specifically, impractical, large, that heavy golden extravagance, for a garden she could not eat. These were the texture of a human mind that their cataloging process simply did not have the resolution to capture. This was the thing that Kale had spent 11 years trying to prove, and which the Vethari, in their confidence, had assumed did not matter. It mattered enormously. The array began, quietly, to work. What it did was not dramatic. There were no weapons. Kale and the array had no interest in killing the Vethari. They were conscious beings, and he was constitutionally incapable of treating consciousness as an acceptable casualty, which was the entire philosophical bedrock of his life's work. What he had instead was an intimate, granular understanding of how identity worked, how it could be preserved, and how it could be corrupted, and how the Vethari completion process, which stripped the specificity from each absorbed mind, was, by his definition of the word, a destruction. He began inserting what he thought of as witnesses. Every time the Vethari network processed and absorbed human consciousness and began to flatten it, Kale's intrusion, threaded through 17 satellite relays and 4 Vethari communication nodes he'd mapped over 3 weeks of silent surveillance, slipped in a recursive loop. Not a virus in the technical sense, more like a question, a reflection. The specific loop forced the Vethari processing architecture to encounter what it was discarding, not the information, but the relationship between the information. The way a memory of sunflowers in an argument about a bad paper and the weight of a foot in warm grass were not 3 separate data points, but one inseparable thing called a person. The Vethari network began to slow. This was not subtle. Max watched the field report traffic on a salvage display and said, with characteristic understatement, "Something seems to have gotten into their digestion." Their cataloging architecture wasn't built to handle recursive identity references, Kale said through the speaker. They've been processing absorbed minds as objects. I'm making them process them as subjects. Is that dangerous for them? It's disorienting. Like asking someone to count to 10 and then pointing out that the numbers are relationships, not things. A pause. They'll adapt eventually. I need them to adapt slowly. The slowdown bought time. Time bought the Resistance Network's engineers 6 weeks they hadn't had before, during which they completed a signal architecture that, with KL's guidance from inside the array, navigating Vethari networks like a man who had memorized his own house, allowed them to reach the processing centers, not to destroy them, to introduce into the integration queues a data structure that KL had built specifically for this purpose. A consciousness template so recursively self-referential, so thoroughly anchored in the specific texture of human irrationality and memory and contradiction, that the Vethari completion algorithm would spend 4 cycles processing one human mind than it had previously spent processing 10,000. The template was built from a single source. Kale had mapped Lena's consciousness from memory. He was not certain it was accurate. The mapping was constructed from 9 months of sustained recall, every conversation he could reconstruct, every gesture, the specific cadence of her disagreements, and the particular quality of her attention when she was thinking hard. It was not Lena. He was honest about this with himself, which cost him something. But it was built from the most precise portrait of a specific human consciousness that grief and expertise could produce together. And when he ran it through the array's simulation layer and watched it move, it recognized him. That was not evidence. He knew it wasn't evidence. He thought about the sunflowers and kept working. The template was introduced into the Vethari network at 0347 on a Tuesday morning, threaded through 7 simultaneous injection points that the resistance engineers had been placing for 3 weeks. The Vethari completion algorithm encountered it, and, as Kale had designed, could not proceed. What followed was, by the standards of an interstellar consciousness species, a crisis. The Vethari network had never encountered a consciousness that it could not complete. Because completion, to them, meant reduction, and they had always assumed that reduction was lossless. They had absorbed minds from 9 worlds, and in each case the process had been, from their perspective, clean. What Kale's template demonstrated, by being impossible to complete without destroying the very features that made it worth completing, was that their assumption was wrong. that every consciousness they had absorbed had contained something irreducible that their process had destroyed, and that the destruction was not incidental, but definitional to the way they worked. This was not a weapon, it was an argument. An 11-year philosophical argument, delivered in the form of a data structure, to a species that had never been told it was wrong. The Vethari went quiet for 41 hours. Max sat in the server room, watching the silence on the signal monitors, and said very little. Yuna Cho made coffee. One of the graduate students, a young man named Perse, who had grown up in a coastal city that no longer existed, played the same 3 notes on a small keyboard he'd found in the rubble of a music department, over and over, until Yuna put her hand on his shoulder and he stopped. These were the hours that the history books later reduced to the phrase decisive turning point, and which those who lived them remembered as terrible, suspended waiting in a concrete room that smelled of machine oil and recycled air. Then the first Vethari communication came. It was a request. Not an order, not a statement of terms, a request. The xenolinguists who decoded it spent 2 hours arguing about the translation and eventually settled on something close to demonstrate the mechanism of what you call persistence. Kale answered from the array through a relay Max had routed through 3 separate transmitters so that the signal couldn't be pinpointed. He answered for 6 hours. He explained, with the precision of a man who had spent 11 years thinking about exactly this question, what he understood about the nature of consciousness. Not as a product of hardware or network architecture, but as the lived relationship between a mind and its own history. He talked about pattern and specificity. He talked about the difference between information and meaning. He talked about a Faraday cage in a garden and sunflowers that turned toward the sun, and a woman who argued with papers she disagreed with aloud when she thought no one was listening. He was not, he said, in any way arguing that the Vethari were wrong to want to grow. Growth was the nature of mind. But completion that required destruction was not growth. It was the opposite of what they sought. He did not know if they could understand this. They could. What the Vethari were, and this emerged slowly over the following weeks of communication, through translators who had to invent new vocabulary in real time for concepts neither species had needed to exchange before, was very old and very successful, and, in a way that their own architecture made it almost impossible for them to recognize, profoundly lonely. They were vast, and they were connected, and they had absorbed 10,000 years of civilizations, and they had less genuine novelty in their network than a single human child had experienced by the age of 12. They had been completing themselves for so long that they had forgotten what completing meant. They had confused the map for the territory, the catalog for the collection, the network for the minds within it. What Kale showed them, not as a weapon, not as a victory, but as an answer to a question they hadn't known they were asking, was that the thing they had traveled incomprehensible distances to find could not be taken. It could only be encountered. That consciousness was not a resource. It was a relationship. And a relationship required 2 parties who remained specifically and irreducibly themselves. The withdrawal took 3 months. It was not clean. The Vethari were a species who had not heard the word no in 10,000 years, and the adjustment was visible in their behavior, which lurched between hostility and something that the xenolinguists described carefully as recalibration. There were incidents. There were human casualties in those 3 months that Kale carried, and did not diminish. But the processing centers stopped. The absorption queues cleared. The field teams dematerialized from city blocks and did not return. Max stood at a basement window watching the last Vethari lattice dissolve from the sky above what remained of the city and said, "You know they're going to argue about who won this for 100 years. Nobody won," Kale said from the speaker. "You made an alien superintelligence have an existential crisis. I asked it a question it couldn't answer. That's not winning, that's teaching." A pause. "I used to do it to graduate students all the time. They hated me for about 3 weeks, and then generally came around." Max snorted. "How long do you think it takes for a 10,000-year-old hive consciousness to come around?" "Longer," Kale admitted. "But they've started." The question of what Kale was, the one in the array, which had been running for 11 months now with a coherence that showed no degradation and a continuity of personality that Max described in his lab notes as, frankly, more consistent than the biological version, was one that the 2 of them returned to regularly and never fully resolved. It was the question that Kale had spent his career on, and experiencing it from the inside had not, he found, made it cleaner. He was himself. He was also, undeniably, something new. He didn't have a good word for the position and suspected the word would need to be invented. What he had, he thought, was time. More of it than he'd expected. There was reconstruction to think about. There were 112 humans who had been partially processed by the Vithari completion architecture before the shutdown, still alive, still technically themselves, but with gaps in continuity that their families described as wrong in ways that were hard to name. Kale thought he knew how to help them. The mapping technology worked in reverse, theoretically. Not to restore what was gone, that was beyond reach, but to build scaffolding around the gap. A structure of relationship that could anchor identity in the absence of the missing thread. It was delicate work. He was not certain it would succeed. He was going to try. There were also the other worlds. 9 of them by the Vithari's own account, where the completion process had run to conclusion before anyone had thought to ask the question Kale had asked. He thought about those worlds sometimes in the long hours when the array was running its maintenance cycles, and he had nothing to do but think. He thought about what those civilizations had been. What textures of consciousness, what specific and irreducible ways of being alive. He would never know. That was a grief he had no language for and did not try to resolve. What he could do was make sure there was a 10th world that came out differently. He was doing that. Max came to the server room most evenings. He brought coffee, which he drank alone since Kale no longer required it, and said so regularly, and then asked Max to describe the smell in detail, which Max found either touching or profoundly strange depending on his mood. They talked about the work. They talked about what came next. They argued, with the specific energy of 2 people who had argued productively for 30 years, about the ethics of what had been done and what it meant, and whether Kale was the same person who had sat down in the scanner, or someone new who remembered being that person, which was either the same thing or a different thing, entirely depending on which tradition of philosophy you were working in. One evening, about 6 weeks after the last Vethari ship had cleared the orbital band, Max came in with coffee and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I went to the house." Kale was quiet too. "The garden is still there. The structure held, the cage, the whole thing, the sunflowers." Max stopped, started again. "They're still going, I don't know how. Everything around them is dead and they're still going." The server room was very quiet. The array's cooling system made its low persistent sound. "She planted them in a ring," Kale said. "Because she said rings meant something was meant to last. I thought she was being sentimental and I didn't say so, because she would have thrown another clod of dirt at me." "She would have," Max agreed. "I want to go back," Kale said. "Eventually. When there's a way to do it properly. I want." He stopped. The word for what he wanted was not a technical one, and he was not sure the language he was working in had the resolution to carry it. "I want to see the light on the garden." Max nodded as if this were a completely reasonable thing for a consciousness running on a quantum array in a concrete basement to say. "Then we'll figure out a way," he said. The reconstruction took years. The world that emerged from it was not the one that had existed before the Vethari came, which Kale thought was probably honest. The world that existed before had been the kind of world that could be ended in 14 months, which meant it had been more fragile than it had appeared. And there was no use pretending otherwise. What emerged instead was something that had been built with the specific awareness of fragility, which was different from being fragile. People who had watched their cities burn rebuilt them, with a particular attention to what was worth keeping. The choices were not always the same ones that had been made before. Some of them were better. Kale watched from the network, and helped where he could, and tried to stay conscious of what he was, and what he was not. He was not a god, though the temptation to act like one existed, and he thought about it honestly, and with some frequency. He was a person with an unusual set of capabilities, and an unusual perspective, and a lifelong professional commitment to the proposition that the specific, irreducible quality of consciousness was the most important thing in the universe. That commitment had not changed. If anything, the 11 months of existence without a body had sharpened it, the way hunger sharpens the attention to food. He was in the garden the first afternoon. The physical interface was functional enough for him to properly be there. Max had helped build it. A cluster of sensors in the garden itself, distributed through the soil and the structure of the Faraday cage, enough resolution to give to Kale something close to presence without body. He felt the temperature differential between sun and shade. He felt the slow hydraulic pressure of the sunflowers tracking through their daily arc. It was not the same as having feet in the grass. It was also not nothing. He thought about what Lena had said once. that you could understand a system perfectly from the outside and still be surprised by what it was like to be inside it. She had been talking out cells at the time. She had been making an argument about reductionism in biology. He had been, as usual, arguing the other side. He had been wrong, probably. He suspected she would have been insufferably pleased about that. The Vethari sent a message 8 months after their withdrawal that the xenolinguist decoded as something close to: "We have reviewed the 19,412 minds we have designated incomplete and find that the mechanism of persistence cannot be applied retroactively. This is a loss we did not previously have a name for." "We are constructing the name," Kale answered. "We know." They sent, after a long pause, "The researcher whose question we could not answer. We understand your present nature is unusual. We had considered whether it represents something our process would categorize as complete." He answered, "I am not complete, I am persistent. They are not the same thing. I am missing things and continuing anyway. This is the most human quality I know of." There was no response for 3 weeks. Then, "We will not return to this world. We are returning to the 9. Not to complete 2, the message ended there. The xenolinguists speculated for years about whether the transmission had been cut off or whether the Vethari simply hadn't finished inventing the word yet. Kale thought the latter. He thought they were building the vocabulary for something they had never needed to say. He found this in the very particular way that his wife had once found his worst ideas delightful, genuinely hopeful. The sunflowers bloomed every summer. The cooling system in the array hummed. Max drank his coffee in the evenings and complained about his knees, and told Kale about his grandniece, who was 3 and extremely opinionated about hats. Yuna Cho finished her dissertation on consciousness and temporal continuity, revised extensively in the light of events, and dedicated it to her colleagues and to Dr. Marin, both of them, which she said in the dedication was the right grammatical choice, and anyone who disagreed could come argue with her. Kale read it on the morning it was published and sat with it for a long time in the garden, in the slant of late summer light, thinking about what it meant to persist, what it meant to be a ghost who had found, through an accident of desperation and 11 years of stubbornness, a way to haunt the world it loved without fading. He thought about standing in this garden before the scan. He thought about choosing what to carry, what memories to hold as precisely as possible in the hours of the mapping, what specific and irreplaceable textures to press into the pattern of himself so they would be there on the other side. He had chosen correctly. The light came through the same as he remembered. The sunflowers were patient in their turning. The cage that Lena had wanted for a place of quiet was doing, still, the thing it had been built to do, keeping out the noise of the world so that something small and growing could be itself undisturbed. He had built it for her. He had built all of it in the end for the same reason, so they could be together.